As Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, I have focused on the importance of taxation in the context of my report of this year to the Human Rights Council on the phase-out of fossil fuels as a matter of international human rights law imperative. In that context, I first of all set the scene by recalling the now extensive documentation of the human rights impacts of the climate crisis. Those impacts are widespread, increasingly severe and compounded, and affect all human rights: the right to life, the right to health, to self-determination, the right to food, to water, to housing, to education, and to work, as well as cultural rights. And those human rights impacts of climate change are disproportionately impacting specific individuals and groups in vulnerable situations, including children everywhere, indigenous peoples, small-scale fishers and peasants, and entire populations, for instance, in small island developing states. And it is important to understand how those climate change impacts also have a multiplier effect on gender-based violence, human trafficking, and slavery. Now these risks are becoming increasingly catastrophic and may become irreparable for a larger proportion of humanity. And this can be prevented, and in fact should be prevented through the phase-out of fossil fuels, which has already been interpreted as an obligation deriving from everyone's human right to a healthy environment, with a view to avoiding significant foreseeable harm arising from climate change onto human rights. But this is also an obligation that can contribute to other dimensions to the human right to a healthy environment, including living in a non-toxic environment and protecting healthy biodiversity, water and food, which are very much affected by all the phases of the life cycle of fossil fuels. So in addition to the contribution the fossil fuels make to harming the climate and the impacts on human rights that I've just described, we also need to take into account the impacts that arise from, for nature, negative impacts on nature, on water, on toxic pollution arising from the exploration, extraction, transportation, refinement, and waste management of fossil fuels. And crucially, all these impacts contribute to worsening the climate crisis, but they also undermine the capacity of nature to regulate climate change and human capacity to be resilient in the context of climate change. So there are layers and layers of human rights impacts arising both directly from the contributions of fossil fuels, which are very much clearly identified by climate science as the main contributors to climate change, but also other impacts on nature, on toxic pollution that in themselves add human rights violations and further harm to the climate system. It is important, therefore, to understand that those impacts also relate to rights to life, health, and adequate standard of living, as well as cultural lives across different generations, and particularly harm due to toxic pollution and biodiversity loss impacts our right to a healthy environment also across generations. We should also take into account that fossil fuels are linked to the production of plastics and petrochemicals, and here again we have further additional layers of human rights impacts, once again linked to how plastics itself contributes to more reduction of nature's capacity to regulate the climate, but also to a whole series of other human impacts on their human right to health, but also to food and to water, and equally the use of petrochemicals in our food systems contributes to worsen climate change, biodiversity loss, and toxic pollution. And all of this compounds the effects on our rights to life, health, our standard of living, healthy environment, and cultural rights. So it is against this background that we then need to understand when taxation is favorable or even is exempted for fossil fuels as a form of subsidy, and any other form of financial protection or benefit that may arise from tax systems for fossil fuels. because all that available finance made to this sector of the industry prolongs climate change impacts on human rights and also undermines states' obligations to devote maximum available resources to the full realization of our economic, social, and cultural rights. So the role of taxation in the context of advancing the phase out of fossil fuels and meaningful advancing the protection of human rights in the context of climate change and advancing climate mitigation is crucial. First of all, we need to consider that production side subsidies to fossil fuel industries are still significant. I think they're estimated at around 300 billion, and this is without counting subsidies for plastics production. And these subsidies, in and of themselves, are contrary to states' obligations to devote maximum available resources to progressively fulfill human rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. And rather, they should be redirected to provide climate finance through transparent and participatory human rights impacts. Also, there's questions around equity. Even when we look at consumption-related subsidies for supporting fossil fuels, and even when these subsidies may be specifically targeting low-income households, usually the richest 20% of households in many developing countries receive on average more than 6 times the fossil fuel-related subsidy benefits of the poorest 20%. In addition, there's other links between taxation and fossil fuels that states need to look into. So tax evasion and financial secrecy linked to tax havens also contributes to that loss of public finance for climate action and further support for fossil fuels and their direct and indirect contributions to our human rights violations due to climate change and other impacts on nature and in terms of toxic pollution. So for instance, in 2024, at least 100 to 200 billion were lost in unpaid tax, equivalent to 4 to 10% of the fossil fuel industry's global revenue. In terms of financial secrecy, I understand that tax havens enable the entrenching of high carbon development pathways, and so this allows fossil fuels owners to abuse tax responsibilities, to break monopoly laws, to avoid international sanctions, launder money, or funnel money into political processes. And my report on defossilizing our economies very much undermines the very well evidenced and increasingly worrying capture of public policy spaces, decision-making spaces from the national level all the way to the international level that fossil fuels are putting in place to obstruct meaningful climate action. But financial secrecy also makes it difficult to monitor the conduct of banks and the accuracy of their sustainability reporting about whether they are effectively divesting from fossil fuels or not. So ultimately, as a result of all these interactions between fossil fuels and the tax system, the tax burdens of the just transition away from fossil fuels are placed on low and middle income households, whereas the loss of fiscal revenue and fiscal incentives for the just transition undermines the realization of our economic, social, and cultural rights and the right to a healthy environment. So to me, I become very interested in the role of tax justice, and I'm very grateful for the work and the studies that have been carried out by the Tax Justice Network and have fed into some of the findings I have included in my report. Because of course the lack of action or inadequate action on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies represents a violation of our human rights relating to that obligations for states to ensure maximum available resources for the full realization of our rights. And this happens either when public finance is allocated to fossil fuel industries through tax breaks, and this diverts available public finance from combating climate change. But it also happens when we're not tackling effectively tax evasion and financial secrecy, and we're decreasing public budgets for the protection of human rights, including health services and education, that are severely impacted by climate change and also by negative impacts on nature and in terms of toxic pollution of fossil fuels. And this is particularly in the context of countries that are bearing the brunt of climate change impacts. But of course, also providing any other financial support to fossil fuels undermines the remaining carbon budget and the services that nature provides to us and the help to regulate the climate system. And this also contributes to diminishing not only maximum available financial resources, but also maximum available natural resources that may be at the disposal of different countries and that are essential for the realization of our human rights. Now, it is really important to reflect on the fact that now in the recent advisory opinion on state obligations on climate change, the International Court of Justice indicated that fossil fuel subsidies may be an internationally wrongful act. And the reason that the court made this statement is to clarify that identifiable conduct by states related to fossil fuel subsidies can therefore be found in violation of international law, and that several areas of international law, not just international climate law, but in fact international human rights law, the law of the sea, international biodiversity law, the Convention to Combat Desertification, and international customary law, because all of this contributes to climate harm and harm to the environment. And the court mentioned this issue of fossil fuel subsidies as an internationally wrongful act to show that there would be legal consequences, international law consequences in terms of state liability. And from my perspective, also in terms of the human right to remedy. So phasing out fossil fuels will be a way to stop a harmful activity that causes harm to the climate system and human rights. It's also a way to provide a guarantee of non-repetition of a harmful activity. So these are two forms of consequences, of also remedies against climate harm and violations of international law and international human rights law. But in addition, tackling the link between taxation and fossil fuels, in as far as fossil fuel subsidies are concerned, can also provide a form of financial compensation. And this will be depending, of course, on whether a state has been historically responsible for climate change, whether they are currently significantly contributing to climate change, and taking into account respective capabilities in the context of climate change. But states would need to take any action in their power, both domestically and extraterritorially, to prevent tax evasion and avoidance, including by adopting human rights due diligence mechanisms for banks, professional service providers, and other financial institutions. And through that, redirecting then the fiscal revenue towards climate action, particularly through grant-based climate finance to developing countries. It would also be very helpful to introduce wealth taxes without undermining the capacity of other countries to raise public revenues. In my report, I also stressed the opportunity in the context of the ongoing negotiations of a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation for states to agree specifically to prevent and combat illicit financial flows, money laundering, tax evasion, and tax avoidance that benefit fossil fuel companies. They should also agree on provisions to enhance transparency of any fossil fuel financing and ensuring redistribution of tax revenue towards climate finance and remedies for loss and damage. So in conclusion, there are three crucial opportunities in tackling removing fossil fuel subsidies and tackling other aspects of our taxation systems that continue to benefit fossil fuel companies. First of all, this is a source of climate finance, and we keep hearing from states that there is not enough available public finance to contribute to climate action, including prevention and responses to loss and damage. But secondly, this would also be a form of remedy to climate harm, both in terms of cessation, guarantees of non-repetition, but also monetary compensation. And thirdly, and maybe even more importantly, tackling taxation that favors fossil fuel companies is also a way to address the root causes of the climate crisis and the other interlinked planetary crises that have to do with biodiversity loss, toxic pollution, and economic inequity.